Let me set a scene. It's 2 a.m. Your security team discovers that customer data has been exposed. The clock, whether you realize it or not, has already started ticking. What you do in the next 72 hours could define your organization's reputation and its legal standing. That's what this chapter is about. Rule 7 and breach reporting. We'll start by pinning down what actually counts as a personal data breach, because the definition is broader than most people assume. Then we'll unpack the two-stage notification duty, the obligation to inform affected individuals and to report to the board. We'll look closely at that immediate intimation to data principles and the 72-hour report to the board and exactly what that report must contain. We'll talk about detection, because you can't report a breach you haven't noticed in time. We'll discuss building an incident response workflow so you're not improvising at 2 a.m. Then we'll walk through a full 72-hour breach timeline as a worked example and finish with a checklist. Breaches are the moment compliance gets tested under pressure. So let's prepare you for that moment now, calmly, before it ever arrives. Let's get into it. Let's start with a question that trips up more people than you'd think. What actually counts as a personal data breach? Many assume a breach means a dramatic hack, a shadowy figure stealing data. But the real definition is much broader, and understanding that breadth is crucial. A personal data breach generally means any unauthorized processing, accidental disclosure, acquisition, sharing, loss, or destruction of personal data or loss of access to it that compromises its confidentiality, integrity, or availability. Let me unpack that because it's a mouthful. It's not just theft, it includes accidents. So if an employee emails a spreadsheet of customer details to the wrong person, that's a breach. If a laptop full of personal data is lost on a train, that's a breach. If a misconfigured database is left exposed online, that's a breach. And here's one people miss. If ransomware locks you out of your own data so you can't access it, that loss of availability counts too. Think of it this way. A breach isn't only someone breaking in to steal. It's also you accidentally leaving the gate open, dropping the keys, or losing access entirely. Here's why this matters. If you define breach too narrowly in your head, you'll fail to recognize reportable incidents when they happen. So train yourself and your team to see breaches broadly. Theft, accident, loss, exposure, lockout. Recognizing it as a breach is the first step to responding correctly. Now that you know what a breach is, let's understand what you're obligated to do when one happens. And the key insight is that there are two distinct duties, two audiences you must notify. Let me lay them out. First, you must inform the affected data principals, the individuals whose data was compromised. Second, you must report the breach to the Data Protection Board. Two separate obligations, two different recipients. Why two? Think about who needs to know and why. The individuals need to know so they can protect themselves, change a password, watch for fraud, take precautions. The board needs to know so it can provide oversight, assess the situation, and ensure organizations are held accountable. Here's an analogy. Imagine a gas leak in an apartment building. You'd warn the residents immediately so they can evacuate and stay safe. But you'd also report it to the authorities so they can investigate and prevent future incidents. Same event, two notifications serving two different purposes. Both matter. Here's the common mistake to avoid. Some organizations think telling one party is enough, or they focus on the regulator and forget the individuals, or vice versa. Both duties stand independently. You can't satisfy one by doing the other. As we go through the next lessons, we'll look at each duty in detail, the immediate intimation to individuals and the structured report to the board. For now, just lock in this two-stage idea. When a breach hits, you're talking to two audiences, not one. Let's focus on the first duty, telling the affected individuals, because the word that matters here is immediate. When a breach affects people's data, they need to know, and they need to know promptly, not weeks later after you've quietly tried to clean things up. Why the urgency? Put yourself in the individual's shoes. If your data has been exposed, every hour of delay is an hour you can't protect yourself. Maybe you change your passwords, watch your bank account, be alert for phishing attempts. But you can only do any of that if you know. Delay strips people of the chance to defend themselves. Think about a real world parallel. If your credit card number was stolen, would you want the bank to tell you right away or sit on it for a month? Obviously, right away, so you can freeze the card before damage spreads. And what should that intimation contain? It should be useful, not vague corporate fog. People deserve to understand what happened, what data was involved, and what they can do to protect themselves. A message that just says, "We experienced a security incident," and nothing more isn't really helping anyone. Here's the instructor's tip. Resist the temptation to delay out of embarrassment or to wait until you have every detail. The duty leans toward prompt, honest communication. Tell people what you know, what they should do, and that you'll update them. Treating affected individuals with that respect isn't just compliance, it's how you preserve trust, even in a crisis. Now let's turn to the second duty, the report to the Data Protection Board. And the number to burn into your memory is 72 hours. When a breach occurs, you're expected to report it to the board within this window, 3 days. That might sound generous until you've actually lived through a breach, when those hours evaporate alarmingly fast. Why 72 hours? It's a deliberate balance. Fast enough that regulators learn about serious incidents while they still matter, but with just enough room for you to gather meaningful information rather than reporting pure panic. Here's the reality check though. 72 hours starts running from awareness, not from when you fully solved everything. So you don't get to wait until the investigation is complete and tidy. You report within the window even if the picture is still emerging. Think of it like reporting a fire. You don't wait until the fire is fully out and you've figured out exactly how it started before calling the fire brigade. You call them while it's still burning, with what you know, and update as you learn more. The breach report works similarly. Here's why this terrifies unprepared organizations and reassures prepared ones. If you've never thought about breach reporting until the breach happens, 72 hours is brutally tight. But if you've built a workflow in advance, which we'll cover shortly, it becomes manageable. The deadline is fixed and unforgiving, so the entire game is won or lost in your preparation. We'll make sure you're ready. Let's get specific about what actually goes into that report to the board. Because showing up within 72 hours with an empty, vague message won't cut it. The report needs substance. Think about what a regulator genuinely needs to understand the situation. Broadly, your report should describe the nature of the breach, what happened, what kind of incident it was. It should cover the extent, how much data, how many people are affected. It should address the likely consequences, what harm might result for the individuals. And it should explain what you're doing about it, the measures you've taken or plan to take to address the breach and reduce harm. Let me make this concrete. A weak report says, "We had a security incident, investigating." A strong report says, "On this date we discovered unauthorized access to a database containing the names and emails of roughly 10,000 customers." The likely risk is phishing attempts. We've contained the access, reset credentials, notified affected individuals, and are conducting a full forensic review. See the difference? One is fog, the other is a clear, actionable picture. Here's a practical reality. You may not have every detail nailed down within 72 hours, and that's understood. The framework allows for the picture to develop with follow-up information as you learn more. But you must report meaningfully within the window. Here's the instructor's tip. Prepare a breach report template in advance with these sections ready to fill in. When the pressure is on, a template turns a chaotic scramble into a structured response. Here's a hard truth that connects everything we've discussed. You can't report a breach you haven't detected. And the 72-hour clock only helps if you notice the breach quickly in the first place. This is where detection becomes the unsung hero of breach response. Let me explain the problem. Imagine a breach happens silently. An attacker quietly accesses your data and nobody notices for 3 months. By the time you finally discover it, enormous harm may already be done, and you're explaining to the board why people weren't told for a quarter of a year. The 72-hour rule means little if your detection takes 90 days. So detection is the foundation. Remember our earlier discussion of logging and monitoring? This is where it pays off. Those logs and alerts are what surface a breach quickly, ideally in hours or days rather than months. Think of it like a smoke detector. The fire response plan is useless if you don't smell smoke until the house is half gone. The detector is what gives you the precious early warning. Here's a real-world reflection. Many of the worst breaches in history weren't worse because of the initial intrusion, but because they went undetected for so long. Early detection shrinks the damage dramatically. So as you build your breach readiness, don't start with the report. Start with detection. Invest in monitoring, alerting, and the kind of vigilance that catches problems early. Because the entire 72-hour timeline assumes you actually know the breach happened. Make sure you will. Let's talk about the thing that turns breach panic into breach competence, an incident response workflow. Here's the core idea. You do not want to be figuring out what to do during a breach. You want to be executing a plan you built calmly in advance. Think about a fire drill. Schools don't wait for a real fire to figure out how to evacuate. They practice so that when the alarm rings, everyone moves automatically. An incident response workflow is your fire drill for data breaches. So what goes into it? A good workflow defines who does what when a breach is detected, who investigates, who decides if it's reportable, who drafts the board report, who communicates with affected individuals, who informs leadership. When roles are assigned in advance, you don't waste precious hours of your 72 asking, wait, whose job is this? It also defines the steps: detect, contain, assess, notify, remediate, review. Having that sequence ready means your team isn't improvising under pressure. Let me give you a real scenario. A company without a workflow discovers a breach and loses a full day just arguing about who's in charge and whether it even needs reporting. A company with a workflow has its response team activated within the hour, roles clear, clock managed. Here's the instructor's tip. Build this workflow now, write it down, assign the roles, and ideally rehearse it with a tabletop exercise. The middle of a breach is the worst possible time to be inventing your process. Prepared organizations don't panic, they execute. Let's bring this all to life by walking through a realistic 72-hour breach timeline, hour by hour, so you can feel how it actually unfolds. Picture a company called Dataflow, R0. Their monitoring system flags unusual data access at 9 a.m. Monday. Thanks to good detection, they catch it fast. The clock starts. Within the first few hours, their incident response team activates, roles already assigned. They contain the breach, cutting off the unauthorized access, and begin assessing scope. By Monday evening, they've established that names and email addresses of around 15,000 customers were exposed. Now, the two duties kick in. On Tuesday, they begin notifying affected data principals, telling them what happened, what data was involved, and advising them to watch for phishing. Meanwhile, they draft their report to the board using their pre-built template, describing the nature, extent, likely consequences, and the measures taken. By Wednesday morning, well within the 72-hour window that closes Thursday morning, they submit their report to the board. They continue the forensic investigation and prepare follow-up information as the picture sharpens. Notice what made this work. Detection was fast. The workflow was ready. Roles were clear. The template existed. None of it was improvised. Now here's your reflection exercise. Mentally run this same timeline for your own organization. If a breach were detected at 9 a.m. today, what would actually happen in the next 72 hours? If that thought makes you uneasy, you've just found exactly what you need to build before it's real. Let's close Rule 7 with a checklist that prepares you for the moment you hope never comes. Start with recognition. Does your team understand the broad definition of a breach? That it includes accidents, loss, and lockout, not just hacking? If they can't recognize a breach, nothing else follows. Move to detection. Do you have logging and monitoring capable of surfacing a breach quickly, in hours or days rather than months? Now the two duties. Do you have a process to promptly inform affected data principals with useful, honest information about what happened and what they should do? And do you have a process to report to the board within 72 hours of becoming aware? Check your report readiness. Do you have a template covering the nature, extent, likely consequences, and remediation measures? Then the workflow. Have you defined who does what during a breach, investigation, decisions, notifications, communications, and have you actually rehearsed it? Now the timeline test. If a breach were detected this morning, could you realistically meet all obligations within 72 hours? And finally, the follow-through. Do you have a way to provide updated information to the board as the investigation develops? Run through this checklist before you need it and revisit it periodically because breach readiness decays if you never test it. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next chapter where we move into Rule 8 and the discipline of data retention and erasure.